afternoon and welcome to the Center for Global Development. My name is Ishani Kanpal. I'm a senior fellow here. Over the course of the past year, a work program at CGD has looked at the issue of gender parity in the development enterprise writ large, with a particular focus on parity within the international financial institutions, or IFIs. Our research has shown that despite decades of evidence that rigorous rigorous and of the highest quality, that there are significant returns to the quality of our work, to the quality of policymaking that come from diversity, equity, and inclusion. Despite that, the development workforces themselves are still far from gender parity, in particular in the management cadres. As part of this conversation, in addition to our own research, we have brought in other researchers, including leading academics who study this topic, who have brought their in-depth analysis on various dimensions of this issue to bear. They've studied things like the effect of diversity on the quality of development policymaking, the gender pay gap at the IFIs, and even the perceptions of the reliability of advice when it comes from male versus female experts. And all throughout, we have intentionally placed at the center of this conversation the lived experiences of the people, the women, who are at the heart, really, of what we're talking about here. We featured commentary from current and former leaders in the development space all through this year. These women have shared their their very sort of personal and powerful, moving stories of the substantial burden that gendered norms, particularly around caregiving, have placed on their career trajectories, as well as the coping strategies that they have used to make it to where they have. And I do want to note that despite all the burdens that we've heard from them and all the coping strategies we've heard about, these are the success stories, the women that have made it to the top. So you can well imagine what the average woman in the workforce has to deal with. We've also heard from IFI leadership, in particular World Bank President Ajay Banga and IMF Managing Director Kristalina Georgieva, who both in wide-ranging conversations here at CGD made sure to touch upon the importance of building a pipeline of women within their workforces, within each institution's technical cadres. So this is work that has resonated, as it should. At the end of the day, diversity among policymakers, as research shows, improves the quality of their policymaking, and therefore who's being promoted and who's not is a question, at the end of the day, of aid effectiveness. But we also understand that there are skeptics and holdouts in every institution, in every corner of the world. Those who don't understand why diversity is important, what it brings to the table. So our goal for this dialogue has been to empower the institutional champions of diversity within these institutions to catalyze the sort of deep-seated change that is really needed, the deep-seated cultural change that is really needed to make a resilient push for diversity, equity, and inclusion, as well as to contribute to a broader conversation about the salience and the primacy of diversity in international organizations and in the countries they work in. So today's event is the next installation in this ongoing conversation, but let me be honest, this event is going to be hard to beat, and you know why. It is my greatest honor and truly a joy to introduce our keynote speaker today, Michelle Bachelet, who's the former president of the Republic of Chile, former United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. The list of her accomplishments is long. I could stand here for the next 2 hours and tell you about them. I will not do that. But President Bachelet is a remarkable and a trailblazing leader. I find it really quite moving to be in her presence today. During her standard-setting career, she has served as both Chile's Minister of Health and its Minister of Defense. I don't know too many other people who can claim to both titles, and she was the first woman to hold the latter position in Latin America. She was the inaugural Executive Director of UN Women, and one of our panelists later today is the now Deputy Executive Director of UN Women. Perhaps most importantly and remarkably, she was the first woman to be elected President of Chile, serving 2 terms, and in a milestone that politicians should aspire to, was elected with a greater share of the vote a second time around. So after her keynote, we will have some time for a moderated Q&A with her. with the audience, and then we'll go to a panel discussion that features senior leaders from UN Women, from the World Bank, from the IMF, and the Asian Development Bank, and I will introduce that panel when we are up here. But with that, please join me in welcoming to the stage the one and only Michelle Bachelet. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chani. I guess people could say, fortunately, it's only because we don't need more like her. No. Well, friends, I'm very pleased to be with you today. And thank you to the Center for Global Development for this invitation to discuss the progress on gender equity, specifically at international financial institutions. But I also will share things that probably you all know, but I think it's important to give the context. I will share my experience as a former president of Chile twice and in international role, as you mentioned, as Executive Director of UN Women and United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. I'm convinced my whole life the importance of achieving gender equality has no parallel. Our world will not accomplish its full potential if we don't harness all that women can contribute with their ideas, vision, and experience. This is fair and the smart thing to do, and all of us probably know very well what Hillary Clinton said in Beijing in 1995, and I quote, "Human rights are women's rights, and women's rights are human rights," end of quote. And of course, we all know, and we're convinced, probably the one who are here, is that women have rights just as men have rights. So, and I'm mentioning this because I have seen a lot of surveys done to young people who are feeling that women are trying to sort of gain rights and affecting them, and that they're losing rights. So we're not asking for anything special. We just are asking for the opportunities we all deserve. And this is not just a women's issue. It's a human issue and a cornerstone of democracy. The progress of our societies depend on this. So that's why we believe that we must defend and promote the universal principle of equality between women and men that comes, written in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but also, of course, upheld in the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination against Women since 1979, as it remains at the forefront of our efforts. Having asked all those framework and clarity on this, the truth is that we have seen lack of progress in achieving Sustainable Development Goal 5, which focuses on gender equality, is detrimental to the overall success of the 2030 Agenda. According to the latest UN Women publications, sorry, Kirsty, I will mention because I always use UN Women's data, progress on the Sustainable Development Goals, the gender snapshot to 2024, the world is still falling short on its commitment to women and girls. Not a single indicator under Goal 5 has been fully achieved. This directly affects the lives of women and girls worldwide. Therefore, it is crucial for financial institutions to embrace this goal, adopt it as their own, and establish objectives that advance gender equality, as they can make a significant impact on people's lives. And I will speak a little bit more about that later. But when I was at UN Women, we worked and we did an MOU. Well, we worked with the World Bank on one hand, but also with the IDB, to insist them that when the country will present projects on, gender perspective should be included in those areas. So to incentivize countries and governments to really consider the gender perspective in everything they did. Maybe one of the most difficult things I had is when they invited me in the World Bank to speak about infrastructure in gender. And I was trying to find example, but I found some. Yeah. So I was saying that it's really crucial, of course, that the financial institutions can adopt their own goal and establish objectives that advance gender equality, because I really think that can mean a very important impact on people's life. One of the things being a UN Women and trying to talk, not the constituencies that were convinced, of course. Usually one of the problems that we have in human rights or women's rights, that we're sitting there, the ones who already are convinced. So I'd always try to think what kind of arguments could I bring to the discussion? Because I had to speak to presidents, to prime ministers, or to politicians, or to parliamentarians. And unfortunately, being myself a politician, principles and values are not always what convince them. So I tried to think how do I show them that it's the right and just thing to do, but also it's a smart thing to do? And I was always looking at narratives or arguments to show that it was, of course, fair, it was right, but it's always so smart to do it. So we needed, and I did it at that time, to convince people in our countries of that. So we need women's leadership to face all of society's challenges. But women, we all know, are underrepresented not only in the IFIs, but also in political, private sector, and academia leading positions. I had just last week, I was at the University of Texas in Austin, and they do have, of course, managerial, they have women, but at the topest level, not that much, as in many other places. Women had not had historically the same opportunity to reach the same position of men. According to UN Women, despite the push for positive legal reforms, no country has all relevant laws in place to prohibit discrimination, prevent gender-based violence, uphold equal rights in marriage and divorce, and of course, guarantee equal pay. So I think advancing women's participation in decision-making is key to promoting gender equality. But to be honest, we need women in key positions, but with gender perspective. Because I have met women who have told me, look, I remember in Davos, having dinner with a group of women from companies, and one of them told me, I am good CEO, but not because I'm a woman, it's because I am good. So I told her, look, I was elected president because I was good, but because I am elected president, I want other good women to have the opportunities that everyone deserves. So I mean to say, because I have worked with a lot of women who don't have gender perspective, who believe in there's no discrimination, that there's no marginalization, etc. So we need women that really are convinced of all the support and all the importance of women's participation in different levels. For example, during the economic crisis, we tried to convince the European Parliament and European Union to include percentages of women in boards of companies. Because all the information that we had, that we were talking before, is that they brought a lot of benefits to companies. And it was less risk takers on one hand, very solid, etc. It took them some time to do it because, of course, but they did it at the end. So I would say when we bring women into decision-making processes, we get, of course, lots of benefits, such as an increase in the representation of women who care more about different issues than men. So we needed, for example, in India, one year there was 1 million women were elected at the local level. And they brought issues to the discussion that was never there before. How you ensure water for the towns, from social aspects, of course, children, family, but also public health, environment, etc. But mainly, I believe that because women have been historically discriminated and marginalized or not included enough, they bring different experiences, a new perspective when public policies are being discussed. And for example, in the economic crisis, Chile did a package. I was the president. We did an economic package. And the economists wrote that it was one of the fifth better package in terms of, not in terms of amount of money, but in terms of the concept. There was not, it was done by my colleagues in finance, all men. There was not a single thing for women that were unemployed. So that's why I mentioned that it's about gender perspective, about considering all this perspective when you are defining public policies as well. I always think, but not every woman as well, and nothing is general, of course. You can never generalize. But my impression is that women, because they have been many times discriminated, tend to be more inclusive. Not all, I have met ones that are not at all, tend to listen more, tend to dialogue more. Again, not everyone. And also tend to listen to other women and to give them a voice. But research has correlated higher net profit margins for firms and lower CO2 emissions with more women in decision-making roles. According to the evidence, women can even make a difference in peace talks, making it easier to achieve agreements and making them more lasting. And of course, women are essential to the economy. In Chile, for example, the central bank estimated that care work that historically women have done and don't get paid for it represents 21% of our GDP, even more than some industries like metallurgy, mining, etc. The latest UN Women report stresses the high cost of not investing in women's rights. Closing the gender gaps in education and skills could add 10 trillion to the global economy. So women participation, of course, benefits societies and strengthens democracy. That's one of my concerns on these days, is that democracy is in a dangerous situation in many parts of the world. But not as in Latin America in the past, when we lost democracy, where it was a coup d'etat. But now you have people who are elected democratically, but when they're in office, they start eroding the democratic institutions. And I think this is very dangerous. Women represent half of the global population, and therefore we bring half of the talents, capacities, and abilities needed to be leaders and agents of change. When you have to deal with these issues, and I see there are some men here, I hope they're all champions of gender equity, but in my experience, that's not always work there. So because Chile is a country who loves soccer, football we call it, but soccer in English, I mean here in the US, I used the analogy to help men understand this, especially when we were competing for the Copa America that we won many years ago. And not anymore, now we're doing very bad. So I used to say our team wouldn't win any matches with just half the players. So if we think about international financial institutions, achieving gender equity, clearly, probably it requires cultural change, but it also demands concrete policy actions. The cultural change should begin with role models for younger generation, of course. We need education programs for a very early age so girls know that they can do anything that they want. When I was appointed Minister of Health, little girls in the health facility will tell me, I'm going to be a doctor when I grow up, and I'm going to be a minister when I grow up. And afterwards, I say, I'm going to be a president when I grow up. So I think one of the important things also, women in every decision-making position, is that it's an aspiration for other girls, for another generation, but it's inspirational as well. And I think this is really important. So we can do, but institutions can implement gender equity policies. And I would like to acknowledge that, for example, women constituted half of the newly hired economists at the World Bank in 2022. But women's representation in top leadership roles, including executive boards, is still lacking across the international financial institutions. Evidence shows that gender quotas have contributed to progress over the years. They have helped to increase women's representation in parliaments and local governments. It's 5 percentage points and 7 percentage points higher in countries with legislative quotas, respectively, compared to countries without such legislation. And we saw this in Chile when I was president. We enacted a law in 2015 that established a gender quota in the candidacy for a more equal composition in Congress. And through that, we increased from 35 seats occupied by women to 54 in the current period in the lower house, which represents 35.5%. To be honest, to confess, I wanted parity in the election, not in the list. But I didn't want that decision. I mean, the parties didn't want that. Mm-hmm. And I asked them why, people from my coalition, why is this? I mean, alone, so he can tell me the truth. And he said to me, because if one of you win, one of us has to go. The truth is that it was true. A woman won, and he had to go. So it's, well. So what I mean to say is that you always, when you try to think on policies or politics, but policies, you need to understand exactly the obstacles, what is really behind, because what is said out loud is different than what is really there. In the Senate, there's only 13 female senators representing 26% of the total. But again, it's not perfect, but it's a concrete way of moving forward. But not only quotas can help. In 2014, the first year of my second term in office as president, I established a commitment to incorporate within the first half of the year at least one woman on boards of what I could manage, that was public enterprises, and to reach 40% by the end of my term. In March 2014, there were barely 5% of women on the boards of the public enterprise system. In 6 months, that figure reached 27%. In 2017, the figures already reached 42%. So what I mean to say is when you are committed to make change, we can make them. It's like another way of saying is when there is a will, there is a way. No? You can find ways and strategies and policies. So according to World Bank data, women make on average 38 and 31% respectively of managers and top leaders. But international financial institutions have to lead with their example to change these figures worldwide. According to a Harvard professor, Eric Rosenbach, who is a former Pentagon chief of staff, having internal consistency, external consistency, and time consistency is key for leadership. So international financial institutions cannot promote gender equality worldwide if they're not promoting it internally. You have to give the example. For this, you need leadership commitment. As we're gathered here today discussing this, I would say that you have it. Leadership at IFIs have to prioritize gender equity, and this should involve setting measurable targets for gender diversity in leadership roles and decision-making roles, and ensure accountability. While I was High Commissioner for Human Rights, and Antonio Guterres, Secretary General, he decided to have half of the top leading positions female and half male. And every time we had to put somebody in a position and it was not a female, we have to respond to New York. Why we didn't choose a woman? And sometimes you didn't choose the woman because, I mean, for that particular position, the man was better capable. We couldn't punish men as well. I mean, you have good men, they can be as well. But what I mean to say is, it was not that we just got to appoint anyone. We have to respond. And they ask us and insist us many times. So I think that's why accountability is so important, because otherwise you can have these beautiful policies, but they're never implemented. And everybody said, oh, but here's the rule. And so we need to be more active and transparent on this. And a few months ago, I participated in the launch of the new World Bank Group Gender Strategy, which identifies advancing women's leadership as one of the World Bank 3 strategic objectives. And I think that's one of the issues of these ministerial meetings. So I think it's a good example of what IFIs could do. We also need to provide training for staff on gender issues, enabling them to understand and incorporate gender perspective into their daily work. Another key issue, and one of my obsessions, is data. As a former president, I know how important data is to make decisions based on evidence. And we really have little data on SDG 5. Thus, we cannot know all that we need about gender inequalities, which makes it impossible to take them into account in policies and decision-making. And for example, sometimes there's a lot of things that, for example, I couldn't give you a recipe of what to do in IFI because I would need to understand exactly which are the obstacles, what are the difficulties. And when I was at UN Women, I read this Harvard Business Review on, I don't remember, it was Deloitte, one big enterprise who wanted to increase women in decision-making positions. After a year, nothing has happened. So then they started doing another more specific research. And what they found out, in one position, they wanted to appoint somebody. There was 2 very good colleagues, a man and a woman. The woman had great performance, and both had great performance before. Both cases, the interview was regular, but the panel, which were the conclusions of the panel? They said the women had a great performance. The interview was not very good, regular. She's insecure. And in the case of the man, they said, excellent performance, regular, not very good interview, he has potential. And this is not something that I created, invented. It's a real definition of what happens. And I went there afterwards to France, and I was speaking to the new first ever female director of TB5 France. And when I told her this story, she said, oh my goodness, I did exactly the same the other day. Comes a woman and I tell her, look, I need all these requirements. And she said, look, I'm very good on 4, but the 5th is not my best. Then comes a man sitting like this, and he said, I'm your guy. I have everything. And I told her I would have hired her because she was honest on what she was not so good at. So I'm mentioning this, it looks like anecdote, but it really describes what happens to many women, usually. And also when I was Minister of Defense at that time, the police forces, the civilian police and the military police, they depended on me. And I found out that talking to the head of the police of investigation, he told me that always there was a 3 name for the first student of the class, I mean the best. Always comes a woman, but at the end, the panel always defines a man. And I asked him, why is that? And she said, I think they do some questions that to produce a difficulty on selecting a woman. So I said, okay, that's finished. So now we have to change the things. And for many more years, every time was a woman, because they were really good. But there were, you know, all these stereotypes are all this bias, that I think many people, even they're not aware of the bias, and they reproduce it when they select people, analyze people, evaluate people. So I was mentioning about data, and because we have, as I mentioned, when we have limited data, we cannot know all that we need about gender inequalities, which makes it impossible to take them into account in policy and decision making. So I think international financial institutions could support the collection of gender disaggregated data to identify gaps and measure progress, because if we don't have data, we are risking leaving people behind. And partnership, I think, could help in this matter, because it's not that the IFI had to do everything. They can collaborate with universities, governments, and civil society organizations could ensure that we have the necessary data to make informed decisions and track progress toward gender equity goals. The other issue I wanted to raise also is to address the importance of intersectionality. Now everybody speaks about intersectionality. 5 years ago, nobody did. And I think the COVID-19 pandemic showed us how different people could be affected. I mean, of course, the virus can affect anyone, but the most marginalized one, the less included, are the ones who were more affected in terms of vulnerability, but not biological vulnerability. It was a vulnerability because of lack of access, lack of services. And then we realized that it was women and girls, older women, living with a disability, of course poor, of course probably rural areas, also people on the move, I mean migrants and refugees, also of course people from the LGBTI, I mean diversity, sexual diversity, and of course people whose mobility was constrained, like in prisons or shelters, etc., for all people. And why I'm telling you this, because I don't even think that in the US you have the intersection of this. We might know exactly how many women, how many men, how many old people, older people. Maybe, estimation of how many people living with a disability. Rural versus urban, etc. But we don't know how many old women, poor, who have lived with a disability, who live in a rural area or are from an indigenous group, etc. We don't have, any country doesn't have. And then what is happening is those groups that are usually the most vulnerable one, we are leaving them behind, even though we say we don't want to leave anyone behind. So I think that this data is really important, and to know all of this, so we could collect and analyze data, and then when we propose programs and projects regarding women, we take all this into consideration. Moreover, you need to make yourself accountable, establishing mechanisms for monitoring gender equity initiatives and their progress. Dear friends, I know I haven't bring you any information that will make me win a Nobel Prize. I just wanted to share with you some of my thoughts, some of the things I've been working in. And advancing gender equity in international financial institutions can contribute to broader social and economic development goals worldwide. I hope that all of you are convinced of the importance of advancing women's participation in decision-making roles. By leveraging some of the strategies that we have talked about today and all of the ideas that you already have and the ones that you will come up with, IFIs can both foster and support women's leadership, leading to more inclusive and effective development outcomes worldwide. Because it's a center for global development, I think it's crucial that women are central part of their job, their task, and of the fight for gender equality. So that women can, so we need everyone on board. women and men, working together towards gender equality so that women can keep stepping into leadership roles, breaking barriers, and reshaping our communities. In my country, there was the first woman who could study medicine was after a Minister of Education defined that women could enter into medicine school. But in anatomy classes, they would put all the men with the body there, and there was a, how you say biombo in biombo? Like a screen between. So it's not clear the reason. Was it that for her not to see a naked body, that could be a man? Or was it that they didn't want the boys there to be, not attending the professor, but the girl there? But anyway, she was the first. I imagine like everyone that has been first has been very difficult, but since then we have lots of female doctors and all the health workers. I think I need to tell you that culture can change. I was Minister of Defense. I represented everything that probably the Commander-in-Chief didn't like. So my personal life, my political ideas, etc. But I have studied defense issues, so I had a very good relationship with them. And in the culture, I don't know if in the US, but in the culture, when you are with the Commander-in-Chief or General, and they're with uniform, you're not supposed to kiss them. Like, because in Chile, we kiss each other, hello, blah, blah. So I started kissing them when I saw them. At the beginning, we're like frozen, but then afterwards, when I came late to a meeting and I didn't kiss them, they said, what happened? What happened? So what I mean to say, I know it seems anecdotal, but I tried to bring from real life that things can change when you produce, when you establish a relationship with others, that you are the authority, they can respect you, but at the same time, you can be a close person, you can discuss all the issues in a way that can be done. You need to behave like a man. I mean, that depends on decision of everyone. I decide that I wouldn't behave like a man, that I would behave like myself, just like I'm being here today. So thank you so much, and I want to say, I know it's not an easy task, but I always quote Desmond Tutu, because Desmond Tutu, you know him, of course, who unfortunately passed away some short time ago, used to say, I am a prisoner of hope. Or she's used two words, prisoner or a hostage of hope. So I always use that because in the type of work that I've been doing in my life, I needed to be a prisoner of hope, to be honest. I have hope that all of you will keep working so our world is more just and sustainable, not for some people, but for everyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We have some time for audience Q&A. I would, actually, sorry, I will be remiss if I do not read out instructions for the online audience. So you are, which I've already been remiss in not reading them out earlier, but you are welcome to live tweet using the hashtag CGD Talks and tagging @CGDev. You can participate in this conversation by asking your questions now during Q&A time and during the panel as well that follows. For those of us that are joining us online, there is a link to send your questions via Slido in the YouTube chat and in the event webpage. So with that, I'd love to just see very quickly a show of hands in the audience for questions. I see a few, okay. All right, why don't we start with Myra, but let me abuse my privilege first as moderator and ask you a question. You referred to this a little bit when you were speaking from the podium, but as in your first term, you had gender parity in your cabinet at the ministerial level. Tell us a little bit about what led to that decision that you made to have gender parity. You talked about the importance of quotas, obviously, that's informing part of it. And also, as you said, that didn't lead to the law that you had hoped to see in place, and a little bit about that process as well.
Well, I mean, my whole life I've been trying to see how I can improve women's situation. As Minister of Health, we also did a lot of programs. We realized there was a lot of mental health problems that, were not treated because they were thought like neurotics or whatever, and they didn't receive any adequate treatment in the public health facilities at the primary level. A lot of things, or that the father could come into when the woman was giving birth. There was a lot of initiative linked to women's situation that could be improved in terms of better quality, more happy lives, etc. As Minister of Defense, I thought that, women were particularly, in the Air Force they have started a little bit earlier, with women could go into the Air Force Academy and they could sort of be as the man there. And then the best rank was also a girl, a woman. So we started pushing the whole armed forces that they should try to incorporate women, but not as the moment that there was like the nurses or like the lawyers. So when I insisted that they should include women, they put uniforms to these nurses and lawyers. And I said, no, that doesn't work. It's not about that. It's about having women in the force. So so what I mean to say, this is something that for me has always been important, because I truly believe that women can contribute from so many different, first of all, that we are capable, even though we need to demonstrate every day our capabilities and our competences, but that we are capable, that we can do things, and that we're important for institutions to have this diversity from different perspectives. Sometimes you're not well understood. For example, one man in a ship, I said, there was petty officers. I was asking them, what do you feel of having women on board? I said, wow, very good. So he didn't get the point clearly, huh? But it happens in many places as well. Huh? With the president of the republic, I was former president, trying to convince him of women's issue, and he just asked me, but what did you do in education, hero? What did you do in this? No, but president, blah, 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 gender equality, etc. And then at the end he said, don't worry, Michelle, I love women. So what I mean to say is that you can use the best narrative, and there are some people that just don't get it. Yes. But having said that, if you insist, because with some of the armed forces it was difficult, or for example, say, okay, we're going to do it. So they put as a requirement, as a height, the statute, the height, that normally no Chilean women have. And that I didn't have. So I said, oh, this minister couldn't be part of your institution then. So, you need to continue looking at all the obstacles and insisting. Why gender parity? Because I love to joke in my first meeting with the cabinet. I said, because I want us to dance. So we could dance. No, but it was a joke, of course, because we also danced, but it was a joke in this case. No, the thing is that I was so convinced that we had great, fantastic women. And that will show for other women in the country and for other women in the private sector, in different sectors, shows that women can make it, can be excellent ministers or excellent Secretary of States and that if you don't show that it's possible, younger generations don't feel that they will have those opportunities. So it was a mix of, and of course, because when I was Minister of Health, we were only 5 ministers in women in 22 or something. And we usually get together when one of them was having trouble, we call them, we support them, we support each other. Sort of, I truly believe that it's more representative of a country when you have a cabinet that is paritarian, and also represent different perspectives, different experiences, and that makes more rich the discussions and the decisions that are being made. So it was completely intentionally, and I think it was a great idea. And I think, if I'm not wrong, it was the first time in the history, because afterwards came Spain and other countries, but at that time it was not very common, I have to say. Did it help in some things? Yes, I think it helped a lot because, and of course the other thing that is really crucial, because usually in some institutions they put women, but they put women in areas like childcare, family, administrative things only, but not on those hard things. tough things. But because I've been Minister of Defense, and everybody saw that we didn't go to war, nothing terrible happened, it was not these weak women and so on, that I put women in different positions, interesting one, important one, because one of the problems is that many times women in some areas tend to talk only about some issues and don't talk about issues that are really important. One of the discussions, in my political party, there was this vice presidency of the women, but every time they discussed in the big meetings was about women's issues. And I discussed with them, no, we need to discuss about foreign relationship, economy, climate change, other issues, because we have opinion on everything. So we cannot sort of put ourselves, of course, I speak a lot about women and environment, for example, on climate change or whatever, but because I can do that, but when you want people to respect you and to understand that you're a person that has a lot of knowledge, a lot of qualities, you have to dare speak about all the other issues. So that's why it was so important for me as well, not only paritarian cabinet, but that women could also play roles in areas that were traditionally, you said masculinized?
Yeah, male, yeah, sure. No, that makes a lot of sense. I love the light touch that you sort of weave in a sense. It makes that push for parity seem so obvious, right? It's almost poking fun at the person asking the question, well, why do I want gender parity? Because we want to dance. It's so obvious, why are you asking me the question? It is really striking throughout your remarks, I think.
But maybe just that, because one of the things that most amazed me, that sometimes interviews with journalists, women journalists, they will tell me, when I was a candidate, they will tell me things like, oh, you are divorced. Yeah, so you don't have a man close to you. No. And how are you going to cope with things? So sort of, where are you going to cry, if I may say? Huh? So I said, do you ask that to the men candidates? And you're a woman, my God, how are you asking me that? So that's why I mentioned that women, not all women have gender perspective. Huh?
Okay, with that, let's go to Myra with a question. And in the interest of time, let's collect two. I think Ratna, you had a hand up. Did I see Alba had a hand up? Okay.
President Bachelet, we know that Chile is a very socially conservative society. You were the first woman president. What kind of strategies you used to navigate what was really up to then a very male-dominated political establishment? And if I can ask also a second question, and that I think you've already talked a bit about, but being a woman, did that influence the policies that you led in the country? Thank you.
Let's take a question back there from Alba. And while we do that, I want to say this is Myra Buvinic, a former gender director of the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank, a senior fellow emerita here, and Chilean. To boot as well. So when she says it's a very conservative society, she's speaking from experience, presumably. Alba, please.
President Bachelet, thank you for joining us today. My name is Alba Loureiro. I am from Paraguay, and I am currently a research associate here at CGD. My question for you is about mentorship, and I want to make the connection to my personal life that coming from a low-income family in rural Paraguay to now studying and working in the United States has required a lot of mentorship from powerful women. And I'm very curious to hear about your experience and what has been your experience with regards to mentorship in the sense of what do you think it is the importance of mentorship in fostering women's leadership, and what has been experiences for you in your own journey or experiences that you have facilitated for other women?
Okay. I think Mayra, you were asking me about strategies that you follow. Well, as I said before, I try to be myself, as genuine as possible. Because I had this friend of mine, she was a trade unionist, and she said that she has to swear in meetings and say dirty words, otherwise they would not respect her. And I decided that's not my way. So my way was to be well prepared, to be able to defend the policies or the things that I believe in, and to try to do it in a way that I could demonstrate. Unfortunately, you always have to demonstrate, and that is really bad, that you are capable and that you know what you're doing. But I have to say, probably if I would have been only Minister of Health, I would have never been President of the Republic, because it's a caregiver, no? It's a care work. Being a Minister of Defense, I think, was the important thing, because that was seen as power, as something that has power, and presidents are supposed to have power. So that's why I think, and there is, again, but you're going to think that I'm really stupid, but I love anecdotes because I think it makes things clearer. There was this flooding in Santiago, and I was Minister of Defense, and there were all the people in the military service working, cleaning the streets and so on, so I decided to go and see what they were doing. And because there was flooded, we couldn't go by car, so I went with a tank. Not a tank because it's a Mohawk that has wheels, but it looks like a tank. And then there was this main picture, me with the militaries on a tank and so on. And then I started going up in the polls. Can you imagine? So why I'm mentioning this? It's because it's also important what symbolically you can do. Because if you only are a caregiver, they're going to let you always in the classification of girly, women, mother. Well, they told me mother when I was elected president, but anyway, a mother that could have power. So I'm telling you this because I think it's really important, the symbolic part. So that meant that people could respect me. But another thing is that this is something we have been discussing with Jacinda Ardern and other former head of state and head of government, is that I have asked myself, is there a feminine kind of leadership? I'm not so sure, because I have met or read about women who were exactly the contrary. But I do believe in empathetic leadership, empathy, to put yourself in the shoes of the other, to listen what the other is feeling, to try to understand what their problem is, and try to find the solutions and think on solutions to those problems. I have met men that are there, but women, and women who are not, but a lot of women who are, and decide to have that kind of leadership. And you know what? Maybe at the beginning, some people can believe that it's weakness. If you dialogue, if you don't shout, if you don't sort of make like the male way of doing things, but they respect you. And if you have, of course, some achievements, of course, if you are very nice but no achievement, that doesn't work. And if you have achievements and people feel that you're doing things for them, at the end, it works well. And the second question was...
mentorship. Mentorship.
No, you had two questions.
The policies. Being a woman, did it...
Oh, yes, as I mentioned, yes, we did. I mean, we always had gender perspective. So, I mean, other than that package that the economists mentioned, but they always try to include what impact, positively or negative, a policy could have on the most vulnerable groups, and of course, women or children, etc., in different dimensions. But also trying to push for a gender agenda internationally, at the regional level, etc. That's not very easy, but we try to do that as well. And on mentoring, I think is key. Mentoring is very important, and we did it. I mean, first of all, as I mentioned before, when you have the privilege, and I mentioned privilege in the correct way of privilege, to be in a high-level position, people listens to you, people can get inspired, so you can do activities. I went to schools, to talk to girls, to universities, to different places where I've been invited, and continue doing so, in different places, so you can share your experience, but share also the difficulties, the barriers, the obstacles. When I was Minister of Defense, and I worked before in defense, not only being a minister, we had a network of women working in defense. And they had a magazine, a bulletin that says, women can do all, but not all at the same time. And I think this is really important, because we usually are with a lot of guilt because our house is not for House and Garden magazine, or because we have to sacrifice. You have to sacrifice something. You might not be the best in everything in terms, because if you like your career, your job, maybe your kids, some will tell you sometimes, Mom, you didn't go to the meeting at school. And those things are true, and it happens because you cannot do everything at the same time. But but you can build is a network of people who can support you. Being, for example, so mentoring is about sharing experiences, explaining why not to do the same mistakes that you have done, for example. And I'm talking SMEs, for example. No? And we did a lot of small, medium enterprises with women who already have done that, so they could mentor the ones who were starting, so they didn't have to start from, creating the wheel, and that's things we did. One in terms of inspiring, in stimulating them to think on themselves and their possibilities for the future. But on the other hand, on particular issues where they could be really win from that possibility. And we did it in many parts of regions of Chile with SMEs in particular, because I think SMEs, when they start, particularly young women, they have a lot of difficulties and barriers and difficulties. But I heard that at the World Bank they do have also a mentoring exercise that I think it will be very important. To learn the lessons that all others have learned already, with a lot of pain sometimes. Huh? So you don't need to start from zero. And I think that for all of that, mentoring is really key.
I do think we're approaching the end of our time here for Q&A. Do we have time for another round, or are we at time? We're at time. Okay. I apologize. I know that there's a lot of excitement. I do want to highlight a couple of things that President Bachelet has said. One is, I think, in your opening remarks, you gave us really sort of a charge for the future. We've sort of shown the lack of gender parity, and you've now said, now figure out what's going on, why the numbers are where they are. So thank you for that. Another thing that I think you've said that I'd like to highlight is the importance of talking openly. We as women, we talk to each other very openly. Many of the things that you highlighted from your personal experiences, for instance, I think would have resonated with many in the room. But we need to have these conversations in front of men so that they understand what our experiences are. That's when, I think our anecdotal experiences actually become evident that they're not anecdotes, they're actually data, because every single woman is experiencing those same things.
Sorry, but we were mentioning one specific issue, is that, two specific issues. One is that you propose something in a meeting, you are just an advisor.
I know where this is going, yes.
And then everybody looks at you, okay, and then a colleague, male colleague, says exactly the same, maybe change one word, and everybody, great, marvelous, fantastic. At the beginning, I was like, what happened? Exactly what I said. Is it that maybe we have to use a narrative that's more like tough? What is it? There is something there, huh? Because I mean, all those people like me. Huh? I work with them every day. But what I said was irrelevant compared to the guy who said exactly the same. So that's one issue that is important. And the other that I mentioned to you is that when I was a minister, because all these things happen to everyone, not only to young people starting. When I was a minister, there was this, when I was a president, I had this Minister of Interior. And he couldn't stand, we had meetings every Sunday night to prepare the week. He couldn't stand that I finished the meeting saying, okay, so this is what we're going to do. He always started talking afterwards, like if he was the one who was in charge. So it's very funny, but the other one was that when I was minister, I woke up early, warmed the food for my kids, that they wake them up, etc., drive them to school. So when I arrived at the work at 8 o'clock in the morning or 8:15, I was already like 3 hours working, a little bit exhausted. And my undersecretary will arrive. He had received breakfast in bed, take a shower, and the driver took him to the office. So he was fresh, completely fresh. And I was really like thinking like, okay, why I mention this? Because when you talk to women, for example, in a shanty town and so on, I said to them, look, this happens also when you are a minister. So we need to change the situation. We need to changes that improve people's life. Sorry.
No, that is great.
I'm Latin American, so that's
thing,
why.
The first thing is called a manslater. When a man repeats what you say and it's heard, that's called manslation. It's so common that there's a phrase for it, right? A word for it. All right.
Well, I've learned. I never knew it in English.
Now you know.
Okay,
This is why we need to have these conversations. So before we thank President Bachelet for so generously making time, she actually came to the annual meetings early. She came to DC early. She flew overnight. She just got here today. I do want to take a minute to thank some key collaborators. First and foremost is Ana Maria Munoz-Boudet, who leads the World Bank's work on women in leadership. And she's a thought leader in this work and a great partner of ours. And I personally really appreciate your partnership in this. And today's event is really no exception. The other person that I would like to thank is Olga Fuentes Contreras, who is the alternate executive director representing Chile at the World Bank's executive board. Without Ana Maria, without Olga, this would not have been possible. So thank you for making President Bachelet's visit possible. And then also many thanks to Co-Impact, which actually funds our work on this, on women in leadership. And so with that, please join me in thanking President Bachelet and stick around for the next panel.
Thank you. Thank you. And good luck. Good luck in the task.
Thank you so much. Oh, sure. Thanks. So I've been told to stand here on this mark while our amazing team sets up the stage for the panel. I do want to say, those of you, and I see several familiar faces here who have been here for several of our events, the next panel now is a bit of a pivot as we're going to move to talking about representation on the executive boards of the international financial institutions. And as I mentioned, we have a star-studded panel for this next round as well. And so as I invite you, are we having an issue with microphone setup? Okay, are we all good? Okay. So as I invite you, please come and join me up here. First, we have Kirsi Mahdi, who is the Deputy Executive Director for a UN Assistant Secretary General, I should say, and UN Women's Deputy Executive Director for Resource Management, Sustainability, and Partnerships. Please join us. She has over 30 years of experience in international development, humanitarian action, gender equality. She has held senior roles at UNICEF, including Chief of Staff, and she was also the Deputy Regional Director for the ECA countries, it's Europe and Central Asia. Next, we have Ambassador Chantal Wong, who is the founding chair she's the U.S. Director, first and foremost, the U.S. Director on the board of the Asian Development Bank. She's also the founding chair of the Conference on Asian Pacific American Leadership. She has a very distinguished public service career, including having served as VP and CFO of the Millennium Challenge Corporation. You were the budget director at NASA. It's just very cool. I did not know that. And the chief of staff at the Office of Management and Budget for the U.S. White House. Next, we have Vuyelwa, I correct my pronunciation, Vumendlini, who is the alternate executive director representing South Africa at the International Monetary Fund. She's a senior economist who's has an accomplished career spanning both the bank and the National Treasury of South Africa, where she was Deputy Director General. Thank you for being with us. And finally, Natalie Franken, who is the alternate executive director for Belgium on the World Bank's board. She represents a long list of countries, which I'm not going to read out in entirety. But she has also been an advisor on agriculture and food security for Belgium's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and has been on the World Bank's board since 2018, which is not something I knew. So thank you all for being here. We're going to talk a lot, continuing sort of this conversation about representation in the IFIs, and we'll focus a good bit on representation on the boards of IFIs. But I did want to start with you, Kirsi. UN Women is the UN agency that is dedicated to promoting gender equality and the empowerment of women, both within the UN system and also globally. And so I'd like to start with a question about representation within the institution, within the system. In 2017, as I understand it, the UN Secretary General launched a system-wide strategy on gender parity. The 2023 report to the UN Secretary General on the status of women, which is publicly posted, and I do want to take a moment to commend all of the IFIs, the UN agencies, for posting the data openly, publicly, for all of us to look at them. And that shows that, unfortunately, even today, women make up a minority of UN staff at pretty much every level. And at the director level, about 40% of positions are held by women, which is definitely representing progress, but we're not yet at parity. Is parity actually, gender parity, a goal for the UN system? And what specific policy actions has UN Women sort of proposed or promoted as part of its efforts to promoting gender equality?
Great, thank you. Thank you for the question, and thanks for organizing this amazing discussion. And it was, of course, wonderful to hear President Bachelet, who indeed was the very first executive director of UN Women. So all my colleagues at UN Women who were there at the time, they're just continuously talking about her and her legacy. So it's just wonderful to see her again. So indeed, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, when he took up the office in 2017 as the Secretary General, he launched the gender parity strategy. And as actually President Bachelet mentioned, he was serving as the High Commissioner for Human Rights at the time, and the Secretary General was really holding all the heads of the agencies accountable for the senior appointments in particular. And actually, there had been good progress, I should say, because by 2020 already, in terms of the most senior levels, in terms of the Undersecretary Generals, Assistant Secretary Generals, as well as the resident coordinators, the gender parity, in fact, was achieved. So I think from that perspective, I think we need to really acknowledge that there's been an effort. If we compare between 2017, we had 5 UN entities which had reached parity. Today, we actually have 28 entities. So again, let's not only look at negative, there actually has been really a positive trend. It's not perfect, but still. Overall, from the whole UN staff, international professionals, and I'm mentioning the international professionals because that's normally the category that we use to measure. Actually, almost 50% are women, 49.8%. So that is relatively positive. And, but specific measures were required. As President Bachelet said, there was really, for all senior appointments, you had to explain why your recommended candidate is not a woman. And it wasn't just something that you write a standard memo. It is really, there needs to be a really, really strong explanation. So I would just say that that leadership commitment has been extremely, extremely important. Now, there were some institutions which were really introducing some special temporary measures to get there. So United Nations Environment Programme, for example, has almost achieved gender parity at all levels in the organization. UNICEF, the organization where I was for a long time, until last year, there actually during a period of 18 months, there were special measures taken whereby a category which is called P5, it's sort of like the start of the leadership positions, we were able in 18 months, thanks to the special temporary measures, to reach 48%, down from 43%. So I think that it is possible, but of course also at the time, if I reflect my experience in UNICEF at the time, there were colleagues, male colleagues who were saying, okay, so I'm a man and perhaps I'm from Europe or North America, so I have no future. And we said, no, it doesn't mean that you don't have any future, but you need to make way to make sure that women have an opportunity. You have had your way for a long time, but that doesn't mean that you don't have the future in the organization. But I think what I want to perhaps really emphasize importantly, the numbers are very important, but the numbers are not the only thing that counts. It's really the culture, the organizational culture shift that you need to introduce and to ensure that there is an enabling environment. Because the issue really is we want to attract women and we want to make sure that the women will stay in the organization. Because we unfortunately see a lot of intake at the more junior levels. And then when we get to the mid-level, that's where we often lose women because of the conditions. So actually at UN Women, we developed for the whole UN system something what is called enabling guidelines, which is really looking at how can we create a more flexible work environment? How can we make sure that the working conditions are more adapted? There are more also family-friendly policies that are adopted. And how do we look at recruitment processes? So really, really important elements there, so that we really ensure that we can not only recruit, that we can retain. And I think really that investment, there was a question earlier about the mentorship, the importance of also then supporting women at all levels. I mean, supporting young colleagues, regardless of gender, but really making sure that there is an investment in young women is absolutely critically important. If I can add one additional thought, perhaps two additional thoughts, I don't want to take too long, but now actually this year at the International Women's Day on 8th of March, the Secretary General launched what is now called Gender Equality Acceleration Plan. And this is something that we at UN Women, we are serving as a secretariat. It's a whole UN-wide effort where we are really scaling up and wanting to accelerate the progress. Gender parity is one part of it, but also what is our impact? How do we ensure that gender equality is realized in the world? How do we make sure that all the agencies in their programs, in their policies, in their approaches are really promoting gender equality and women's rights and women's empowerment? So that's another step from 2017. That's a broader step that is not looking only parity, but is looking more widely. And perhaps lastly say, of course, United Nations, I've been now talking more about the progress in the Secretariat and in the UN agencies. But United Nations, of course, is all the member states. They comprise the United Nations. In 2001, we had 5% of the permanent representatives, meaning the ambassadors of the member states to the UN in New York, women, 5%. Today, at least, it's 25%. It's progress. It's not yet there. It's not yet the parity, but at least there is a progress. Thank you.
Thank you. That is fantastic. Also, thank you for setting up the stage perfectly for the next three sets of questions I'm going to ask, because they really will focus on those politically appointed positions. That is exactly what you described for the UN. And what's really striking is that in the IFIs, actually, they're generally topping out the boards at about 25 to 30%. So that is striking that that's where you are as well in the UN. I do want to highlight a couple of things that you said, which also, I think, call back to President Bachelet's comments. The importance of specific measures, and we've talked about this up here a few times now, but I think today more than before, we've heard like a really clear call for things like targets and quotas and very careful tracking and breaking down. And I really have to commend you for the detail with which you've described this process, but the process itself, which, as I understand it, is very much in your purview at UN Women. So thanks for describing that. And the second is this investment in young women. Really well taken point, and this point about being at parity at entry. But I think sometimes, and you mentioned this briefly as well, we forget that we need a second round of investments when women are getting ready to step into leadership roles. We talk a lot about lactation support. Menopause is something that affects 50% of the population. We don't talk about menopause. And women who are getting ready to step into leadership, that's what they need support with. President Bachelet did talk about the importance of caregiving, and that never goes away if you have someone you care for. That does stay with you your entire career, but it is really important to remember that older women who are getting ready to step into leadership roles have distinct physiological needs, and we need to start talking about those openly as well. Thank you. Chantal, so you represent the United States on the Asian Development Board's bank. In our data set of 7 IFIs, this is a CGD working paper, for those of you who don't know it, done with Brian Webster and Charles Kenny, where we looked at HR data over a 20-year period from the 7 major IFIs. ADB actually has some of the poorest outcomes in regards to gender equity in the workforce. For instance, in 2013, 28% of managers at the ADB were women, and in 2023, that number is 32%. This represents a 0.4% increase per year over a 10-year period. The number of women in senior management positions has remained virtually unchanged, going from 1 to 2 in that 10-year period. So beyond America's executive director, which is a really important role, obviously, for America, the United States to fill, and President Bachelet talked about the importance of, choosing women when and where you can. And clearly, the United States should be commended for nominating you in particular, a woman of color, an LGBTQ woman of color. But what is the role and responsibility of large stakeholders like the United States in doing more than just nominating a woman ED?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for this question, and thank you for having this really important conversation. I would say, this is not the first time I'm at the ADB. President Clinton had appointed me there. And I would say from that point of view, we were probably at 5%. And so we have made significant progress. Yes, at the senior level, we still have ways to go. But in terms of across the board, there has been parity. I'd say maybe even more. And there's a difference at the ADB because the largest representation of women are at the administrative level, at AS, NS level. And so we do, at the international staff level, we are very much the numbers you've quoted. So huge gender gap around that issue. And so there's a lot of work that we're working on. ADB has had strategies, frameworks, gender action plans. So the newest one that we're working on is this corporate results framework where all of the institutions take targets. And one of the targets will be on gender equity in terms of our management and international leadership. I would also say that there are challenges being in Manila. It's not the best. It's much better than when I was there in 1999 in terms of access to lots of services, health services, and all that. And then if you're married and partners coming to an institution like that, finding jobs for spouses is also very difficult. And so those are all barriers that we recognize in education and schools and whatnot are all barriers that we would like to make sure that there are initial, at least access issues around. So the targets will be there. We will be pushing very hard in terms of recruitment and whatnot and promotions. And then on the board, it's very interesting. What we've done on the board is 4 years now standing. We've actually had a board working group on women and on gender parity. And so we put those statistics out there and then got all of the governors to be supportive of it. And in fact, the last meeting, our annual meeting in Tbilisi, actually even before that in Incheon, all the governors made point about the report and that there's really lack of women on the boards. So I don't know if it's because of that or because I'm there in terms of the numbers. We've actually increased. So now we're both on the executive director board as well as the alternate. We're bigger than, we've got 33%, and that's increased from when I second time, I was the only woman on the board. And now we have 4 executive directors, and that's 33%. And the alternates are about 33%. So it's actually better than any other peer institutions, I would say. But we have a small sample size. It's only 12 executive directors. So we need to keep at it. And the other thing is, the other statistics that I like to quote is, for the very first time, we have 4 openly gay LGBTQ person on the board as well. So those are all important because of what President has said, that the issues and the things that we're going to be working on has huge impact because of our role and our lived experiences on those.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And thanks for highlighting the importance of intersectionality, and we'll come back to that. Natalie, let me go to you next. You're one of the co-chairs of the Gender Working Group of the World Bank, and Chantal just mentioned one of these as well. These working groups, for our audience, they are focused on representation at the board level. Tell us a bit about why that's important. Chantal sort of alluded to this herself. Critics will say, well, you're talking about 20 to 30 people at most, and in some sense, these are already very privileged people. Do we really need to be worrying about, and what good will it even do to spend sort of constrained resources on working on representation at the board?
Yes, I think it's really very important, and thank you for being here. It's a pleasure to be here. But I think it's very important to set a good example. And I think in terms of the bank, we've also, if you look at the statistics 5 years ago, female representatives at the board were on average, if I look from advisors to executive directors, we were at 30%. And executive directors, we were also at like 10%. The last couple of years, this has increased, but we're still not there. And we can say, okay, at ED level, we're at 25%. Yay, great. But no, it's not good enough. We should go to parity, and we should really set a good example. And so one of the topics at the annual meetings now is promoting gender equality. The World Bank Group cannot get a higher certification of the EDGE certificate because we're not having the required percentage of female executive directors. So the Gender Working Group is also raising awareness, trying to make sure there are male champions. We do a survey every year. We write an annual report. We also try to raise awareness of what's happening at other MDBs, try to liaise with other MDBs working groups to share best practices. And I think it was very interesting when we introduced. So we're now launching a declaration for governors to sign to go to 40 to 50% of women representation at ED and LTD level within the next 2 cycles. When Olga and I introduced it, because I do it together with my colleague Olga Fuentes, who is here, the Chilean LTD, when we introduced it, the colleagues were like, no, we can't agree to that. No, I mean, what are you asking us to do? It has to be based on capabilities, on expertise. It cannot just be based on gender. Of course it's based on capabilities and expertise. You would never nominate a woman that is not capable of doing it. That's not the question. And when we said, look, this has happened already. You look at the IMF, look at the Inter-American Development Bank, look at the Asian Development Bank. They're like, oh, really? Oh, I'm not sure my capital knows. And some of the capitals, because sometimes it's representatives from different ministries, they don't always talk. This had not trickled down to the capital level. Now, very happy to see the Summit of the Future document that speaks about IFI reforms, also about more gender equality at IFI boards. Very important to see that step being taken forward. But that is, I think, why the gender group is important. We're collecting data, organizing seminars, mentorship, trying to seek the male champions that are there, also trying to make sure that the coordination and communication with governors and bank management is there, ensure a safe working environment. So we try to create more access to the anti-harassment coordinator, the ombuds, the mediation, the mental health and well-being services at the bank, also to the ethics and internal justice. We have like an understanding that the dean and the co-dean have to have the gender balance as well, which was also a step forward. And we also we're working on having a mandatory course on unconscious bias which is expected to be launched very soon, because we do notice that male colleagues join, and it's not necessarily out of not necessarily that they don't want to recognize women, but it's just also unconsciously what President Bachelet was saying. She said, well, sometimes you see we mention something and a man picks it up and all the men, they echo it. And when you tell male colleagues, they're like, oh, really? Do we do that? And sometimes it's about making them aware, and they'll start echoing you because they're more conscious about it. And then also one statistic I would like to launch here, I think the females in the, and that's why we have a particular constraint, but I'm very surprised to hear that the UN statistics are very similar, because we have a particular constraint in the finance sector. I think 15% of ministers of finance of all World Bank Group countries are female, and only 9% of all central bank governors are female. This needs to be changed.
Thank you. On that manslation, I will say, when I started this work program about a year back, I started talking to women who work in this space. The first time I heard someone else talk about this experience, and I'd had it a few times early in my career, actually a couple of weeks back even, I thought this is interesting because, and it's important to talk about publicly, because you know what, the first time it happens to you and you're 20 years old, 25 years old, whatever, and what you take away from it is there's something wrong with the way I communicated. But it's only when, with a few decades since then behind me also, but also when you hear about all these other, like literally every woman that I have ever talked to who has worked in mixed workspaces with men and women, every single woman, right down to Michelle Bachelet apparently, has had this experience. So really, I don't think it's us, or at least it's not just us. We'll come back a little bit more to the work of the Gender Working Group. I'm eager to hear about that. But Huelva, I wanted to ask you, you're an alternate ED, but of the 24 current executive directors on the board of the IMF, only 3 are women at this point. And I think if you add in the alternates, you're probably not a whole lot more either. The way that the alternate EDs work for multi-country constituencies in particular, such as the one that Huelva represents, you sort of rotate, you take your turn. And so at any given point, what is the board composition is a pretty good snapshot of how many women are sort of out there in the mix between EDs and alternate EDs. Now, the IMF's own DEI report, just like you mentioned, Natalie, mentions that notes that the IMF, like its peer institutions, I'm quoting, is unlikely to attain that highest EDGE certification level in the short run because it is so far short of the EDGE requirement of having 30% of its board be comprised of women. And the IMF's DEI head is here, and I really do want to thank you for the honesty and detail that is in that report. And really, again, I do want to commend the IFIs for being as transparent as they are in these reports. Tell me, again, you're a member of the IMF's working group on gender diversity on the board. Tell us about why it's important to have executive directors, and maybe building a little bit on what Natalie said. And if I can also ask you to speculate for a bit, why do you think we see so few women EDs across the IFIs? We've heard that same number, and if you want to include the UN and the permanent representatives, it's across the system.
Mm-hmm. No, thank you very much, and again, thank you for inviting me to this important event. Yes, at the IMF, the numbers are very low, and our gender working group is working really hard to try to improve the numbers. The last IMFC meeting, we had the governors at least agreeing to soft voluntary targets of getting us to 30 to 40% by 3 election cycles. So we're hoping that by 2028, we will have at least 30% of female EDs on the board. With the elections that are going underway, for the first time, we have 5 female EDs who are being elected. It has been an improvement, but on the downside, the number of alt EDs is going down. So in a nutshell, we are the same. Nothing has changed. Senior advisors, there's been some improvement. Advisors has actually gone down. So why is it important that we have females on the board? Just to argue issues from their perspective and also the experience that they have. It's very different from men. We are 50% of the population. We have our own ideas, different experiences. It's important to get that sort of balance from all angles. And we have seen the sort of richness of discussions that have actually happened. Sometimes you find men going round and round, in one point, and women, I don't know, maybe because we always want to get to the results because we have so many things to do, be the ones who push things together. Let's get to the end result. We have dealt a lot about why is it so difficult to get women in these jobs. And part of it is the mentorship that the President spoke about. And we have also created a mentorship group within the IMF women working in the OEDs. We also have engagements during the spring meetings and annual meetings to talk to the delegates to say, this is what it means to come and work in the ED's offices. Which is information that they don't have. And I mean, there are also challenges, again, around moving women. We have, I don't want to say we have far much more responsibilities than men, but we found that in the board that when men come to become EDs or alternate, it's an easier move. The women are able to come and even give up their career a little bit for a year, for those 2 years, and to support the men. But many of the women EDs or alternates who come, you'd find that they will say, no, my husband stayed back at home. I'm just here with the kids, because they don't really want to give up their careers, so to say. Again, the decision makers of who the EDs are, it's the capitals back home. It's not really the people here sitting in Washington, D.C. And all of these targets are there. They seem good to have. It's politically correct. Come up with a target, you want more females, yes. But as to whether they will actually do it, no, you will not, you won't see the difference. I mean, we saw it now with the current elections that only 5. We're a little bit disappointed, but we thought we were moving into in the right direction. We have fact sheets that we send to the governors on an ongoing basis, and it's, the message is just not there. So to move the needle, you do have to have a way of how do you enable accountability. And until we get there, I don't see us making such big strides or moving the needle that much if it's just going to remain voluntary. Mm.
So just on this issue of targets, since it has come up so much today, right, from President Bachelet onwards, I think, both of you, Kirsi and Chantal, you've talked a bit about the importance of targets. I'm just going to sort of lob this out there. I don't know if anyone wants to address this, but why is it important to have targets that are not just voluntary, that are being monitored and tracked?
Well, I mean, well, it's a no-brainer. We have to, because we need, exactly what Wilma was saying, we need accountability. Mm-hmm. We need to have a mechanism to hold ourselves and hold others accountable, the decision makers, leaders, and ourselves. I think that's absolutely critical. And I think, and I think President Bachelet already said that. Gender equality, gender parity, yes, it's the right thing to do. It's about the values. It's about the rights. I mean, let's face it, half of the world's population are women. We need to make sure that we have also equal representation of women. So, and equal representation of the society overall, also in all of its forms of diversity. So that's absolutely critical. I mean, if you think when you are speaking with stakeholders or partners, don't you come across as much more relatable and something that others can, that you can reflect the people whom you represent. You can reflect the people with whom you work, with whom you seek to engage. I think that's absolutely critically important. And I think that's not perhaps answering your question of why it's important to measure, but it's just like, this is the critical part of how we can make a change, how we can actually influence the change in the world. So having those commitments and really truly making sure that whether it's the IFIs, whether it's the UN system, whether it's the member states themselves, like the PRs, when I tell you 25% of the PRs, again, it's similarly, it is the decision of the governments. It's beyond the UN's influence. It's a decision of the governments. But we have to help all stakeholders, whether it's governments, whether it's private sector, make those right choices. If I can just mention one thing, we have launched some years ago something what is called Women's Empowerment Principles. These are actually principles that we are seeking private sector CEOs from private sector companies to sign up to. And now we have over 10,000 CEOs who globally have signed up to those principles. And those principles call on the CEOs and on the companies to really commit themselves to make the changes on parity, but also on the more family-friendly conditions in the workplace. To look at all of their supply chain, look at their procurement system, look at and accountability, they are being held accountable for the results. So I think that's for me, I'm sorry I said it's a no-brainer, but it's just so important. We cannot just make principle statements and commitments. That time is over. People will hold us accountable. We need to hold ourselves accountable for that change.
Yeah, I hear that, and you reminded me of something that Minouche Shafiq said on the stage as one of these conversations, is that the international organizations, they're not just any employer. In many ways, they're beacons. Yes. And they really need to be leading, not following. And in, for example, some of our work on board representation, we actually find that they're very much following the pack when the comparators are, with the exception of the G20 group of finance ministers, which, as several of you have alluded to, is quite not diverse. But other sensible comparators, the IFIs, the international organizations, they're not leading the pack whatsoever when it comes to board composition.
On targets, though, I think all of our institutions, I know at the ADB, it's always, if there's a target, we are always very focused on that, right? Gender target or climate change or anything that is really focuses the whole institution around that. So I'm glad that we do have targets.
Let me push back on that slightly, though, because people would say, well, fine, you reach the target and then it's done. So what is the next step? What else do we need?
Well, I would say that I'm actually having this argument with our gender team that they say, yeah, we overshot the target. Well, I think you didn't make the right, this is on gender in our projects, gender equity in our projects. I said you didn't do the right, make the necessary methodology in terms of what the target should be or what constitutes gender equality in your projects. So I want data. I want also analytics around what is the gender within an gender in the economy, that kind of thing. But yeah, on the representation, it is targets, and we need to be focused on those targets. But we're not done. I mean, we're far from being done, right? When we say 30%, 30% is not sufficient. So we need to overreach beyond that.
Yeah. Can I just quickly add that? So it's really how do you also achieve those targets? I think that is the important part when you say methodology. So yeah, it is important. We set those targets up so that we have a clear path forward and we can hold ourselves, we can measure progress and hold ourselves accountable. But it's also important, the quality of those targets and how do you actually get there is critically important.
Yeah, the process, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yelva.
I actually just wanted to say something about the targets, again, from the male's perspective. During our big discussion, when we were coming up with the voluntary targets, one of the males did say, what if we get to 51% women? What do we do? And it's like, that's not the point. So, I mean, I'm just saying that from the male perspective as well, you have to worry that once you get there, is it okay for them to be on the other side of 50 and not okay for women to be on the other side of 50? So you look into that. I just wanted to mention something from my country, South Africa, where I come from. For about actually more now, where you would find that in cabinet, there will be parity of women and men. And the ANC government, which has been the ruling party for a while, except for now, had what you call the zebra model, where they will send a list to those who will represent them in parliament as well as in cabinet. It will be male, female, male, female, male, female. The men did not like it, but it was enforced, and it ensured that you have parity at all angles. So in a way, it forces the whole accountability. You have to do something. Leaving something as optional, voluntary, is not going to move the needle. Oh, yeah, thank you.
I just wanted to add to that on the World Bank report, Olga and I set a target of 40%. We thought, okay, we mirror the IMF. And then one of the male colleagues said, no, come on, be more ambitious, raise it to 50. And all the men were like, yeah, that's a good idea. So we were, yes, okay, we go from 40 to 50%. So we're very happy about that. But I think it's just, as you said, I think it's also about making sure in the European Commission they had voluntary targets. It kind of paved the way towards obligatory targets. And now we're also in parity in the Commission. And I just spoke to somebody there, and I think it's very important to kind of pave the way towards the parity hard targets. And then one thing I wanted to add is, for my own country, in Belgium, you have 30% of women on, 30% of board members of private sector companies need to be women. And there was a lot of resistance against it, but it's a matter of also, and then there's now a group of females, women on boards trying to recruit and help with the recruitment and finding women who have the competencies to be on boards. And they're there. It's just about talking to them and convincing them that they have the right skills, because they do, but they are not. They may be concerned because they have other family obligations, or it might not be the right time in their career, or they are there. It's just about finding them, making sure they're prepared for the job and are ready to take it on.
Thank you. That makes a lot of sense. Let me just see. Are there questions in the audience? I see several hands. All right, so we will leave time for that. Natalie, before we start bringing the audience in as well, just very quickly, tell us a little bit more about the draft charter that you mentioned that the Gender Working Group of the bank's executive board has put together.
Yes, so the draft charter is putting all the statistics out on well, first of all, very strongly supporting the new gender strategy of the World Bank Group, the implementation plan, and we're very happy that it was a co-creation process with also board members. And of course, certain targets still need to be developed, and we will contribute to that. So it's kind of recognizing what the bank is doing, recognizing also what the bank is doing internally, because there's more female representation in the bank at middle management and senior management. So I think recognizing that, but also most importantly, making governors aware of the fact that we are still hovering around the 30% ED and LTDs, and that we would like to go towards 40 to 50% in the next 2 cycles. And these are voluntary targets. I think what was still a challenge is that we would have liked to see it broadening up to wider diversity and inclusion targets, and that was a very difficult conversation with the global membership of the board, over the board and the World Bank Group. So we're happy that we are now supporting the targets for women representation, and I think let's hope that we can take next steps after that.
Thank you. Chantal, you spoke about intersectionality a little bit earlier. You are the first LGBTQ woman of color who has achieved the rank of ambassador in the US government. Tell us about how these aspects of your identity inform your work in the region, in East Asia and Pacific. And take a bit, if you will, of that historical perspective. The first time you were on the board of the ADB was under the Clinton administration, and now you returned to its board in 2022, I understand, under the Biden administration. So what has changed? What hasn't?
Well, a lot has changed. I was there with my partner, and we had big challenges in terms of visa. Being there, she had to leave every 30 days, and then we managed to get a domestic partner, a domestic help visa. That didn't go over very well, if you can imagine. And then, if you remember, Vermont in the U.S., Vermont had the first civil union law, and we came home and got married, or got civil union, and then ADB, because I was on the board, took it to the Department of Foreign Affairs and said, because the United States, well, only one state with civil union recognizes this legal union, we will go and ask for a spousal visa. So we did. And so this is the year 2001. A huge step forward. And then, of course, the Pope decided to visit the Philippines 2 years later, and somebody took our, and we had already split up, by the way. We came back to the U.S., and some low-level person in the Justice Department took it and publicly revoked it. But that was the year 2002. Today, it's very different. If the country recognizes your legal marriage, you are able to get a foreign diplomatic visa in the Philippines. So the Philippines has really changed. But having said all that, I came back. So I had actually retired. MCC was my last federal job. I retired and became a photographer and traveled the world. And I was convinced to come back to the ADB because ADB was about to review its safeguards policy, and then to put in the whole issue about intersectionality into safeguards. And so today, we're still not finished with that environment safeguards framework, but there is now a definition of vulnerable groups that the President Bachelet talked about, right? The disadvantaged, disabled, elderly, sexual minorities, but also religious minorities. These are all intersectionality. It's now defined in the policy, which I think for the World Bank, it's not in the policy, it's in guidance, if I remember correctly. It's very hard to implement if it's not in the policy. So we fought really hard to have that included. So I call that below the line, is do no harm to that community. But we are now actually doing some really interesting things, thanks to the work that we do together with the World Bank on the gender strategy, because the gender strategy now has a diversity of gender identity. We are now working towards having a SOGI roadmap, even, to look at countries, where there are countries in South Asia particularly, the governments are actually asking for, Bangladesh has a third gender, for example, category. So these are all the things. I came back to the ADB because I could do something like that. And so that does inform my work. As you mentioned, this is an accidental thing because I was a budget analyst, a budget director at NASA, and all those places I was doing budgets. So these are issues that actually are very new to me, and the community has been out there really helping me. Those that got me through the nomination process and through the confirmation process, which wasn't easy. With here in the Senate, that's 50-50. Well, 51 right. Now. Hopefully, we are going to keep it that way. But it is really what is driving my work around the region. In our region, there are still 17 countries that have criminal laws that for same-sex.
Criminalize homosexuality.
Criminalize same-sex. But the bright star is that there are 3 countries now that recognizes gay marriage, right? The latest being Thailand. So we see progress in the work that we're doing, particularly above the line, providing benefits to the community around.
Thank you for that really candid reflection that I think is a beautiful illustration of why lived experience matters.
Yes.
Kirsi, just following off of what Chantal said about the challenges of working in the various countries that we do. You've spent your entire illustrious career in the UN system. What do you think are some of the greatest challenges and the greatest rewards of working on these issues in the countries in which the UN works?
Thank you so much. I mean, I think it's really quite shocking. We carried out a few years ago this gender equality attitude survey. It's just in 20 countries, but it's really 20 countries representing the globe quite well. And I mean, it's shocking numbers because there were over 30% of the respondents who said that they felt that men are able to do high-paying executive jobs. And over 40% of the respondents said, oh, women are well suited to lower-paid service jobs. On top of that, we've done some surveys about the younger generation and about young men in particular. And similarly, attitudes like, oh, women should stay more at home. So there is a really, I mean, the reality is that there is a sort of diminishing space, and it's quite shocking. I have to tell you, for me, it's shocking where we have come today, that the things that I had come to take granted actually are now being challenged. And I think really what was said earlier, sort of the sense like, oh, if others have rights, is somehow away from me. And that is really the challenging part. So we need to make sure, perhaps I mentioned before, it's about rights, it's about values, but having equal opportunity, having equal access, having gender equality, having rights and empowerment for everybody in the society. It's not only about values and rights, it's also the right thing to do, and it's a smart thing to do. It's much smarter. And actually, I have some interesting anecdote on this one, because just last month, just around the time of the high-level segment of the General Assembly, high-level week, we launched a study, outcome of a study that we did in collaboration with Oxford University. We had the privilege of having access to data that normally is not in public domain for major multinational corporations who are selling products. These are products that we all in this room and online, we are all using in our daily lives. Over a 4-year period, these companies gave the data related to almost 400, to be exact, 392 of those campaigns related to those products. And the question we asked was, did advertising that is more inclusive, that shows the society as inclusive, equal society, did that contribute to the profit margin? And it did. There was no expectation that the answer would be yes. The researchers from Oxford were very clear. We did not expect that to be the case. This is really objective, groundbreaking research. It showed there was actually 16% increase in the longer-term sales for the companies, for the products, which showed where the advertising was more inclusive. After 15% increase in the customer loyalty. I mean, this is groundbreaking. So I'm just saying, like, there are those challenges, but there are also the opportunities for us to change. And I think that's important. And so we need these institutional policy changes, but at the same time, we need to help to shape the attitudes and the social norms in the society. And this is where this research that I just quoted is actually part of something that we are hosting, which is called Unstereotype Alliance. It's an alliance of several hundred advertising companies. And these companies are committed to fighting against the negative stereotypes. Mm-hmm. I think this is the type of work, so we need to have that work going on hand in hand together with the policy reforms and together with the quotas and the protective special measures.
Yeah, actually, this is really important. It's all about economics, right? And so we are actually doing also some of the studies at the ADB in some countries, in Bhutan, Nepal, and one other country, I can't remember which one, but it's really on the economic cost of exclusion. And with that data, we talked about how important that data is. It is, Professor Lee Bachelet has done this with the World Bank data, I think, in India, that she's found at least 1% impact on GDP for exclusion.
Yes.
And so this is very important to evidence that inclusion does pay off.
Absolutely. Yes, it does. All right. In the interest of time, I am going to move to, so Ratna, we skipped you the last time around. If we can get a mic over here. And let's take, I saw maybe 3 hands. Can I? One more. Okay.
Thank you. I have a comment and a question, and this really relates to the issue of quotas, which I think needs a little more discussion. I led the first gender mainstreaming strategy at the IMF, and this was for the 190 member countries. And what was amazing is even within our own group, the core group, we couldn't agree whether we should talk about quotas or not. Forget about the wider and forget about the board, which was, there was only one ED at that time, maybe. But what I want to say is, and the reason I say that we need a little more discussion is because this morning I was at an event where the Algerian authorities, actually parliamentarian, was saying that they had a quota of 30% in their parliaments. And there was such a huge backlash. So this was, so in 2013, yes, because of the quotas, it was 30%. And today, because of the backlash, and the reason they gave was, okay, this is not democratic. We are a democratic country because women are being nominated. So now it's like 8%. So they've absolutely gone back. But on a positive note, I just want to talk about a study that I just finished in India. Companies' law was imposed, which imposed at least one woman on every board. And there would be penalties, financial. What is amazing today is, this is for all listed firms, what is amazing today is that virtually all firms have at least one woman, but the more amazing part is that the majority of them have 2 women. And what that reflects is that it is a business case. They are hiring more than what they actually needed to. And when there were no quotas on management, top C-suites, in India right now, more than 70% of listed women have 0 women. So, to me, I've been really, how can I say, torn on this issue of quotas. Does it depend upon the timing? Does it depend on the country? I mean, how do you decide? So that's my question to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's take one more in the interest of the gentleman back there. You can just pass it. Thank you. And this is Ratna Sahai, a non-resident fellow here at CGD and a former gender lead at the IMF.
Thank you.
And please do introduce yourself.
Yeah, sure. I'm Peter Chawla. I'm at the Financing for Sustainable Development Office at UN DESA. We work very closely with UN Women. It's great to see you here. So I had a question about sort of putting this question of gender equality in the boards within the broader context of governance reforms at the IFIs. So the first time the gender equality commitment came into the sort of commitment level for the boards was in 2015 at the Addis Ababa Action Agenda. And I'm not convinced that it had much impact at that time because it's in this, along with the overall commitments to governance reform, and I think we've seen a lot of resistance to governance reform at the IFIs. So I'm wondering, but now I think there's open conversations. We've got a new 25th member of the board coming for the IMF. There's talk, I mean, at least our Secretary General has called for expansion of the size of the boards. Do some of these other avenues for governance reform open up possibilities for addressing some of the gender questions that are we're seeing not as much progress as we'd want in terms of expansion of women on the boards?
Vuyelwa, would you like to start?
Phew, that's a bit of a difficult one, because with the 25th member coming in with the board, we were hoping that at least one of the African countries will bring in a female ED, and that still that's not the case. So, but I think it has brought focus on gender issues, because outside of the female old EDs, not female old EDs, female EDs, to say we are increasing the numbers, we juxtapose that with, can we also improve the number of EDs? So we'll see as to how but it didn't change the needle at all in terms of increasing the number of people on the board. The issue about gender, I think really it's got to do with the state, should I say maybe the state of mind at that point in time, and whether you want to see progress or not moving forward. But if you don't have a target, there's nothing to focus on, and you don't enforce it, I honestly don't see how else you will be able to move forward.
So there's a difference between target and quota. So I was talking about formal quotas.
Or the formal quotas of the well, South Africa is taking over the G20 next year. Part of our big deliverable is to do the realignment, come up with perhaps maybe a new quota formula that can be implemented with the 17th General Review of Quota. So we will see how that goes, because really that is a political decision, and it's going to depend largely what actually happens in November in the United States, since they do have the veto with the quotas. Many of the emerging market economists were quite disappointed with the last 16th General Review of Quota, because it did not come with alignment at all, and that actually affects the legitimacy of the institution and so forth. So at least there's the commitment on that part. Everything was eco-proportional, but it does, with the quotas, it does affect the number of resources that countries are exposed to. So if you are a vulnerable country with huge financing needs, and you have low quota, it means you've got less access to money, and that comes with a whole host of things, of surcharges and so forth. So we will see next year as to what happens.
Thank you. Natalie, did you?
Yeah, no, very interested to hear what's happening on the IMF quota. I just wanted to add on the female quota, whether we think it's appropriate. I'm a very strong, and I had a discussion with President Bachelet, and Olga and I had a discussion with her during the summer about it. And I think we're very much on the same page that if you don't have quota, it will not change. But what is very important is to socialize the quota. At the Commission as well, in the beginning there was a big revolution of the men saying, oh, we won't stand any chance of promotion, and this is unfair. And I think it's about, okay, first voluntary, maybe kind of not be too ambitious, then trying to make sure everybody's on board, and then, so it needs to happen stepwise, because if you introduce it too fast, like in Algeria, it's just not going to work.
Either of the two of you want to come in on?
I just want to say that there's huge backlash here in the United States around DEI, around quotas, around all of that. So I don't know the answer, but we think we were making progress, but now there's huge regression going on.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add, thanks for the question. I mean, it is a challenging. I think it depends on the situation also, I would just say. I think what is important that we keep in mind that if we look at, for example, parliaments, national parliaments, or local level governance mechanisms, that we are creating the conditions and we are supporting the participation of different candidates, that we are supporting women's participation, because we are seeing in so many cases also, I mean, the violence against female candidates, again, I mean, you know, the whole digital attack. I mean, this is in all countries in the world. Yep. So, including in mine, Nordic countries. I mean, so it's absolutely everywhere. In many places, it's really physical violence. So we really need to work on the social norms and understanding and helping everybody to see it pays off. It pays off that everybody in the society is represented. All different perspectives are represented. It is in all of our interests. So I think that's the, I would just wrap up perhaps with that. That's a key issue.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I think that is perfect. So Chantal has to get to the White House, and I'm not going to keep you from that. So we will wrap up here. I do want to thank Britt Robinson, Sarah Vaugeois, and CGD's comms and events teams, as well as Brian Webster, who's over there wrangling a mic. Thank you all, and thank you all for coming. Again, the many familiar faces that come to all of these events. It's great to see you. I really appreciate sort of the energy that all of you bring, the audience brings to this. So thank you, and hopefully the rest of you will be around. I know there were several other questions, so please join me in thanking our panel.